Welcome to our author interview and Q&A with our September 2025 graphic novel high school plus edition, which is the Will Eisner Comics Biography. I'm here with the authors and illustrators. So Stephen Weiner is the co-author of the title, along with Dan Mazur, who is also the co-author and illustrator of Will Eisner, A Comics Biography. So welcome. Thank you for joining us and talking to us about your wonderful title that we are so excited to introduce to our customers in September. So I guess my first question for you is, one of the reasons why we chose this title for a JLG selection is that we saw that it had this great appeal to readers. We know that there's so many high school readers that are very, very interested in comic books, graphic novels, the format in general. So this being a biography, I wanted to just get some information from you, like what is it about the title that's really going to draw in that high school reader into this format and give them just a different perspective of the history of comics and graphic novels?
Okay, well, let me take a crack at that. The reason that a teenager would be interested in this book, well, there's several reasons, but one is because Eisner's story is a story, his struggle is very similar to the same struggles the teenagers are dealing with. Eisner grew up in abject poverty, and the comic book industry was just being created, and he got in on the ground floor. So he was one of the people that had to make the comic book industry work, if for no other reason than for him to feed his own family. And he was a very creative person and saw endless possibilities for comics. And so he, and because of that, he really formed, or was one of the people that formed the way the industry developed. And so as a young person, he created a company that created heroes. The most famous one is probably Sheena, and the second was The Spirit. And then he also resold stories to the bigger publishers. So he started his own company, and that is because he couldn't make a living as an artist. So he came up with a way to make a living, and then that worked out very well for him. And comics becoming so successful that he was asked to create a newspaper supplement for newspapers. They're trying to catch on the comics wave in the early 40s. He created this character called The Spirit, and it was a magazine put out in the Sunday papers. That was very successful. And he did that for 12 years. And then he was losing interest, and he became, and then he started a publishing house where they did educational comics. And he did that for about 20 years, and he was getting very bored. And then he learned about the changes in the comics industry, and he returned to comics, returned to storytelling. At this point, people were doing more individual stories, more personal stories that came out of the underground comics movement, but he didn't want to do stories about sex or drugs or anything. He did his own stories. He told his own story of his life. He did it in what we commonly call one of the very first graphic novels. So he became one of the most important and lifelong proponents of the form of comics and how comics developed. And he influenced that development through his own vision and his own will, really. But another reason why it's so impelling is that it's really a story of vision, of self-determination, and because he had to create himself, because there was no prior model. There were no comic book people before he was 18, 19 years old. It didn't exist. So it was a voyage of self-discovery. And the reason the form is so inviting, it's because, well, comics are just a natural draw. It's really hard, if you like a comic, to stop, because they flow so easily. The pages flow very easily. So for those reasons, I think it's a natural thing. And the other reason why it's of particular interest to school librarians, it was a lifelong interest of Eisner to get comics into school libraries. And when it started to happen in the 90s, he was very satisfied. It was great satisfaction for him.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all that. I would say that it's, for kids who are interested in what is now ancient comic book history from the especially from the first half of the 20th century, who may be familiar with some of the titles that still exist, like Captain America and so forth. I think what we tried to do is show the experience, the personal experience of being in that era and creating from the ground up and from the gutter up, you might even say, a new form of the comic book, because it was brand new when Eisner went into it. He really did take part in creating it. And I think what appealed to me, and I would appeal to most readers, I think, is just the energy and the drive that it took for Eisner and everyone else to make this new form and this new business, and the excitement of working really hard for very little money, but making something brand new. And I think another way in which it relates to what creative people, and especially young creative people, are going through today is because of the changes in technology and media today. If you're creative, you really have to be a business person as well. All the old rules and the old gatekeepers and the old systems are falling apart. And I think that's what one of the things that really makes Eisner's life stand out is he never made that choice between being a businessman or an artist. He was always both. And he had that creative vision and knew that in order to make his creative vision come true, he also had to run his own business, and he did that. And we try to also make that very personal and show how that came out of his childhood and his early family life, with a father who was sort of a creative dreamer and a mother who was a hard-headed, not a businesswoman, but she was running a household and watching the accounts. And so I think that we try to take that sort of abstract idea of the business and the creative side and show where it comes from and how much kind of conflict it takes to make that come true.
I love all of that background and all of the appeal that I think that still resonates with kids these days, even though it took place in a different time and Will Eisner is from a different time. I think there's a lot that kids can relate to.
He was a kid when he started
Yeah.
he started one of the first comic book companies. He was not even 20 years old. So
yeah. So it's definitely inspirational to our high school readers. Was there something specifically about Will Eisner and his life and his work that drew you to create a biography about him?
I will leave that to Steve, because it was Steve who drew me into the idea of doing a book about Eisner.
Well, what initially attracted me to the story of Will Eisner was this, a lot of things I said in the first, to answer the first question, is that really his vision and his dedication to comics and his sense of rediscovery. I mean, when he, as an older person, I mean, I met him when he was about 70, and a lot of at that time, young cartoonists met him, and he was very excited about young cartoonists and the form, because he just had perpetual interest in the form. But that was one of the main things that drew me to it, was his real sense of discovery. The other thing was really his sense of vision and his sense of perseverance and his belief in himself, because as Dan said, when the comic book industry was starting in the mid-30s, he was 19 years old. And so his mother actually wanted to become a teacher and get a stable profession. And it was a stable profession in the 30s, actually, to go into teaching, because they had to have schools, so they were employed. But he decided to take a chance. He decided to bet on himself. And so he started this company, and the company did well. And as I said before, he went on to do many things, but it was really his belief that he could make this thing happen if he just worked hard enough. And he worked night and day. I mean, this young man had no time for vacations, had no time for romance. He had nothing nothing was on his mind except making this business succeed. And not only was his business going to succeed, if his business succeeding really changed the landscape and helped the entire industry succeed, because he was one of the suppliers for these companies. So without him, there might not have been enough material to sustain the industry. And then the other reason was because he was really such a great teacher. He became a teacher in the 70s, and he taught at School of Visual Arts for decades. So I really felt that his story had to be told, and had to be told in a way that was accessible. There's actually 4 different biographies of Will Eisner, this being the 4th, and this being the only one that is done in graphic novel format. So those were the reasons why I thought that's such an important story to tell.
So quick last question. If you were to choose your absolute favorite, either comic or graphic novel, the one that had the biggest influence on your life, your career, your work, what would each of you pick? Just one.
Does this have a Will Eisner book? Is that what you mean?
No, just
Any
in general. Like, what is your favorite? What is the one thing that's inspired you just as an author illustrator?
I'm gonna let you go first on that one. Think about that.
There are a few kind of like tentpole comics and graphic novels that have inspired me. So I'm going to choose one, as you asked, and I'm going to choose Love and Rockets by Jaime and Gilbert Hernandez, which is a series that's been running since the early 80s and is still going. It's created by 2 brothers, Mexican-American brothers from, I think, Oxnard, California. And, I think it came at a time for me where comics were sort of, seemed to be sagging a little bit in inspiration. And it's just so it's this ongoing series, follows the same group of characters, for 40 years. They age, and it's beautifully drawn, and they follow, and it has this freedom of being both kind of a realistic character drama comedy, and then when they want to, they go to outer space or there's robots, but it's very much in the real world. And it kind of has this beautiful art style. I'm actually talking mostly about Jaime Hernandez. Both of them are great, but it's the Jaime part that I'm raving about. Has this kind of incredibly beautiful art that to me is probably more influenced by the art in Archie comics than anything else, but just taken to this level of graphic, both beauty and expressiveness. So yeah, it's a massive work, because it's 40 plus years of comics, and it's kind of hard to recommend, because like, how do you start? I say, just go back and read it in order, like I did, because I read it when it came out. But yeah, so Love and Rockets.
Awesome. Stephen, I put you on the spot there.
Well, I'm like Dan. I'm struggling with a single influence or single, most important work, and I think I'd have to with a series called Manhunter, and it was done in the mid 1970s by DC Comics, and it's the reason I think it was so important, and so important to me, was that it was one of the very first attempts at making superhero comics grow up, in the sense that this was a story about, they took a hero that they weren't using this character anymore at all, so they reinvented him and gave him a whole different backstory, which was much more adult. He was involved in espionage and that kind of thing, and it was really a book for older readers. It wasn't a book for older teens, but it wasn't a book for children. It was a book for older teens and adults, which they were trying to attract. And it was also a limited series. So they were able to come up with a conclusive ending that there would be, there would be no other Manhunter stories after this. So it was really, in my opinion, it was one of the first attempts to create an entire story around an ongoing character.
Mhm.
And I think they did it extremely well. The creative team was really superb. And I would just highly recommend it. It's a very accessible book, and it's actually pretty easy to find right now. So that would have to be a number one, even though it's hard to come up with a number one.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Those were good recommendations, I think, for our high school readers or librarians who are going to listen to this great Q&A interview to give additional readers advisory to their students. So thank you again for joining us. And we're really excited for this to come out into our September shipment.
Well, great. Thank you.